after how Wonka lobbied to get his Oompa Loompas into the state and still work for him, he has the whole government under his belt. There's no crimes happening in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Deep in the D-Pad. In this episode, we're going to be talking about personal identity, consciousness as it is explored through games like Soma or Psychonauts, and also how player consciousness is affected by games. I'm RK Taylor, and with me, as usual, is Carlos Gutierrez.
Hello and welcome.
Before we jump into our D-Pad delights, I'm going to ask that you recommend our dog episode to any of your friends, any of your family, just anybody who likes dogs. Maybe they don't like games. They might still be interested how dogs are represented in games. I think it's a really accessible episode. It's super fun. Highly recommending that one. If not that one, pick a different one. Find a friend who does like games. Maybe show them our old gamer culture episode or the one on revenge. Share us. We need you to help us. But now, let's turn to our D-Pad delights. Do you have something related to transporting consciousness that you can...
Yeah, there was this one time I went to a chocolate factory. But no, so I have something that's not per se transporting consciousness, but it definitely was like this like otherworldly experience, I guess. And that was like the first time I tried VR. I was in the studio. It was like a calm day. One of my friends had brought in their Vive setup, and this is like when the Vive had like first come out, you know, and shit was just like, the lab was out there, Audio Shield was out there, a lot of Gen 1 VR stuff was like starting to pop off, like budget cuts, all that, what have you. And when I tried it out, I just had like such a mind blown moment. And like, I did have, you know, the office space around me, and I kind of understood that. I definitely like lost track of that fairly quickly as it was my first time in VR. But like, it felt so just like, whoa, I am in a different place. Like, if there's an entity near me, like, you know, I mentioned budget cuts. I played the demo for that, and I was like throwing knives at robots, you know, and trying to like duck under things to hide from them. And I was so just in that world via the like, you know, encapsulating my whole field of view plus like the sounds and like that type of thing. I think there was also maybe a fan like in the nearby area, and the level just happened to be in like a sort of windy environment, so that was hitting extra as well. Like that, once I took the headset off, I had that weird like moment of like my brain was having to readjust to no longer being in this like robot dominated society and like flat like hypercolor like things. It's like, oh, okay, now my walls are white again, and I got the beige cubicle dividers. All right, I'm gonna sit at my desk.
That reminds me of my dad. I showed him VR once, and like it was Crisis VR, and he's a vet, an army vet, and he got so immersed in like the tactical aspects of Crisis that he like ran into the coffee table that I'd already moved out of the way, and like, you know, it was like just completely ran through the Guardian, you know, like, what a mess. My D-Pad delight though is about fear in World of Warcraft. That was a spell that would cause the player to flee in the opposite direction of the enemy, or perhaps just a random direction. I'm actually not sure. I think that there were some kind of like zigzag motions, or, you know, it wasn't just a single path, if I'm recalling correctly. And you couldn't attack, you couldn't move, and there was just this, you know, again, like this isn't particularly delightful, but unless you were using it on someone else. But when you were, you know, affected by this fear, it was a really like frustrating experience, and not in a way where like the game was punishing you. It was just like you were trying to help out your team, or you were trying to do something, you know, very particular, and you were locked out of all of your abilities, you know, all of your ability to move and all of your spells or whatever. And I feel like there aren't a lot of things like that in games. You know, games are about kind of like empowering you to like have powers that you don't normally have, or to like, you know, be this special person. But this particular debuff was just eviscerated like your autonomy, your agency. And it raises questions kind of in the game about like, what is the consciousness, of a person who's controlled by fear? Are they having thoughts? I think that there are a number of philosophical questions that are engendered by this. Like, are their perceptions changed? Are they able to think? What's their range of emotional expression that they can have? Could someone who's afflicted by fear cry, for example? Do they not even have control over their eyes or, involuntary reactions? Obviously it's not real. So these aren't questions that we can actually answer. But it makes you think about consciousness a little bit differently, in the same way that a lot of different mind control stuff does. It's not like it's the only mind control type of maneuver out there, but I think in general, the more we think about mind control, the more curious we can be about human psychology and like the limits of agency.
That's really cool. And funny enough, that reminds me of Batman. I guess specifically, like, say, Batman Begins, because that one had the Scarecrow in it, and he, would make this special toxin to like trigger, your senses to see the most fucked up stuff based on what you thought was fucked up, I guess.
Yeah, Harry Potter had that thing too, right? There was like a creature in Harry Potter, I can't remember what it was called, but it would like show you your biggest fear. Right,
exactly. And like that got people to do like just wild stuff. We actually end up seeing that again in the games. It goes from the movies to the games where like Batman Arkham Knight, the third and like final one in that series, or at least, the main trilogy. The game opens up with Scarecrow like releasing the toxin on like a diner and or a city block, and you see like cops think there's like, monsters everywhere, and they're pulling out their gun and killing people in the street, and it's just full on like, holy shit. Like I guess we're really pushing the fear to the chaos like hard. So again, yeah, like fear, rather than making people, WoW characters run around and you simply not losing control, it's showing like how fear within like a big society setting like just makes shit go sideways so fast, and that's why there are a lot of stories out there that tell us we cannot be led by our own fear. We need knowledge and courage to overcome whatever trials and tribulations await us.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's not really saying anything about free will. Those are just kind of like hokey, like with the right virtues, anything is possible. If you shoot for the stars, you'll end up on the moon or some stupid. It's like, what does that mean? Like, if I shoot for the stars, what if the rocket explodes and I die? I'm like, I don't want to be Stardust.
At least you tried.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Whatever. This is going to be a pretty dense episode in terms of like, I think we're taking on philosophical explorations, I guess more directly. We're taking on philosophical explorations more directly than we have in the past. 2 episodes ago, again, we had that episode about dogs, right? And it's like now that's like pretty much the opposite tonally of what we're talking about now. This little harder stuff, but it's also super fun because we can all relate to having consciousness, right? And we did talk about that, what it's like to be a bat, which, is kind of providing, we talked about qualia and like the link.
For those who didn't see the episode about what it's like to be a bat, or that featured that segment, can you give like new people the TLDR for it?
Yes. So Thomas Nagel in the 70s, I think, wrote this paper, What is it like to be a bat, wherein he describes bat echolocation and uses it and uses the fact that we, like, as humans, don't have the capacity to echolocate, but identifies that echolocation is likely an experience, that bats are actually experiencing something as they're echolocating, to kind of justify the fact that they have consciousness. So, many people will say that bats have consciousness because they have experiences, or we can call them qualia, right? They have a certain set of experiences that allow them to function throughout the world, right? So we're kind of, that's kind of consciousness centric, right? And what we're going to talk about today is in philosophy is called personal identity, and that's pretty like adjacent to consciousness, right? A lot of the times our theories of personal identity are grounded in consciousness, and we'll get more into that later. But let's start with some like really relatable media that like showcase consciousness, right? Like you and I have been making jokes about Willy Wonka all day, baby. So you talk me through the Mike TV situation and like what arises in you, or you know, whatever. Where do you want to go with like these like mainstream media things?
So we've been talking a lot about Willy Wonka recently, and it's because like I keep joking about the Mike TV thing. Mike TV, right? His situation, he's a kid who's really into TV, wears the cowboy hats, John Wayne era, that type of stuff. And he's like, oh, if I get on this stage, then I can be on the TV. And he goes on Willy Wonka's stage. Turns out to be like a discombobulator ray or a teleporter, some shit. It zaps him. He gets turned into like thousands of little pixel particles that we can see traveling through the air, when in actuality that seems very like problematic, because like what if there's a gust of wind? Do we suddenly lose those particles? But anyway,
a speck of dust, like he's like recalibrated or not recalibrated, but like
a fly gets into his pixels,
yeah.
And it's straight up he's Jeff Goldblum, like all grossed out. And so like that is to say, like, yeah, Mike TV goes through this very dangerous like breaking apart of his atoms and then putting back together, but he's now small, he's in the TV, and it's like a shrink ray but also a teleporter, funny enough, I guess. And from there we never see Mike like go back to normal. But also my question was like, is that Mike? Not like
for sure.
It's there. So like something else though, right? Is like is that Mike? Maybe this is what we should just tackle right now. But it's like, is that Mike? Like, did we end up losing a Mike when he got disconnected and now gained a new Mike that just has all of those memories when he's reconnected? The other thing I wanted to investigate with the Mike TV situation is, let's say for the sake of argument that when Mike gets hit by the beam or whatever, like Mike ends up just standing there, but still we see particles go across and then a new little Mike appear, right? But they're both looking at Mom like, Mom, what happened? Like, what's going on? I'm Mike. Like, what? Like, I would like to explore that situation and see like who is Mike at some point. But we could start with the whole like what happened to Mike going from point A to point B with no clone.
Okay, yeah. So this reminds me of there's a philosopher, Derek Parfit, who died a few years ago.
Okay.
And he wrote a book called Reasons and Persons, and he explores personal identity throughout that book. And he has this essay that like really, or this chapter that became really famous, that was basically about like a teletransporter is what he called it. You know, I guess that was, you know, this is like a Star Trek, you know, around like the times that Star Trek is relevant. So, you know, these kinds of thought experiments weren't everywhere, you know. But so he proposes this thought experiment where someone gets into like Spock gets into the whatever, you know, a machine, and he's rematerialized somewhere else. All the atoms that are rematerializing him are separate, are different atoms than the ones that were in the ship, right? Because like how could they be the same? But they're, you know, placed in exactly the same spots. All of his neural networks are still primed in exactly the same ways that they previously were. You know, he has all of the memories and all of the thoughts of the person that he was previously. And it's like, you know, is the identity of person A and person B the same, right? And Derek Parfit, you know, people have been arguing about this for, you know, hundreds of years, and Derek Parfit comes along and he's like, the identity is not the same, but that's not what matters because you have survived, right? And he makes a like kind of a metaphorical leap where he's like, if the person that I am when I get married is like, I'm going to be a different person, but it's not because I've died. It's because I have changed, you know, and as long as my, you know, memories are intact, and as long as like the bulk of what makes me in a like more like kind of like emotional way, you know, like we expect growth, we expect change. So the idea that things have to be identical is almost like a silly focus, right? That's what he would be getting at, right? So for the Mike TV example, like assuming that no clone, right? It definitely raises some complications when there's a clone. But if there's no clone and it's just you go from person A to, a smaller version of person A, but we'll call it person B, he still has all of the moral weight of, if Mike TV as the normal sized child killed someone and then became small, that small person, with all the memories and all the feelings that he had committed murder, still is deserving, the moral repercussions, or, he's still blameworthy, right? He's not a completely different person just because he rematerialized out of, thin air. For the record, I know that I'm making statements here, but these are all these arguments, right? I'm not actually stating this as a fact. There are a lot of different takes on this. So, where are your intuitions? I mean,
I feel like I stand on the side of there is a death, in terms of the teleporter taking you from point A to point B. I think there is a death, that moment of breaking apart or whatever. And, I only can hope and cross my fingers really hard that, you do actually come back, when you're on that other side. But, it just seems too unlikely or too, impossible a task. I know, physically, there's probably going to be a point where we can figure out how to deconstruct physically human and then put it back together, but whatever we don't know about the mind, I think is still so unexplored that taking that shit apart would be taking your first computer being the Watson supercomputer, and now you have to take it apart and put it back together with little to no manual.
So you think realistically the dematerialization, rematerialization, human beings are too complex for that to actually be a route that is even possible?
For us to maintain that consciousness that we've had.
Yeah,
yes.
Including all your memories and everything. Yeah,
correct. Yeah, I think they can copy it and make a new person that's going to act as you. But I feel like the you that had lived from birth to whenever you use a teleporter, that one of you is just gonna die. It's gonna get erased, and your consciousness is going to just the TV turning off, white line across the screen, that type of thing, and you're not going to realize it. It's going to be the blink of an eye. And the new you is going to have the memory of going in this teleporter, all that. And again, you, original person who stepped into the pod, is going to be fully gone, while the new you, which will be it's going to be logistically the same person, but in terms of actual Ship of Theseus, that's going to be a new copy of you.
Right. I'm not sure if this is more or less contrived, but we could also think of the example of after your death, your consciousness is uploaded, the moment before death, it was uploaded into a computer. So you can immaterially continue to exist. And I think that that's another illustration of surviving despite the fact that your personal identity, you are not the same item, you're not the same thing, you're not occupying the same space or, whatever. But we would clearly recognize even if you were some really sophisticated computer program, right? If instead of Watson it was Carlos, and you're on Jeopardy cracking jokes and losing terribly to Ken Jennings,
right.
We would still say that is Carlos. That's what remains of Carlos. He has survived to some extent. If we're gonna buy Parfit's argument.
Yeah, and I agree with that, the surviving to some extent, because again, logistically, the same person is there, but that consciousness, that experience, everything leading up to that point of teleportation is what is no longer with us. We get this new consciousness that's almost it's probably a perfect, for the sake of argument, a perfect copy paste, but it did not experience, that consciousness was not physically there and processing, what led up to the use of the teleporter. It is now it has the memories of like all that stuff that had happened, but it didn't do that itself. And so now this new teleported in consciousness, reconstructed consciousness is like what's going to carry on.
Yeah, that's such a sick legal argument. Like, I could go out with my car and just like mow people down, and then I just like dematerialize and rematerialize my consciousness. And I was like, cops, you got here a day late. Like, you know, that was the guy yesterday.
I offed myself, man. I took the teleporter. Like, can't get me.
Right. But okay, so, you know, like, I'm joking, right? But like, do you still feel like a person who did that? I mean, clearly they would still be a threat to society because they would still have the same intentions
I'm not
and
saying that people can. I'm not saying that a different person. Gosh, this sounds so stupid, and I'm so sorry, guys. Like, I am and I am not saying that a different person comes out of the other side. Okay,
but there's
so,
a death and rebirth that is philosophically relevant.
Yes, there's a philosophical death and rebirth happening, like, but it is that same character, like, of all the bad actions, good actions they did beforehand, like, they still, like, will be thinking that way, they'll still, like, have that weight on them, and I 100% agree with that. Like, if we had, like, a serial killer walk through the teleporter, like, you know, and he has 3 active charges, like, still arrest that guy, that is the serial killer, and they will go on to keep going, right?
Let's take it to games now. I mean, I feel like this is like, you know, an introduction to some concepts in personal identity, and now where do you want to take that with games?
It's funny you mention uploading your consciousness right before the transportation, right? Because like that's actually a lot of what Soma has around it. Like they don't explicitly say it until later on in the game, and I'm not sure how familiar with Soma you are, but for our audience, if you have not played Soma, there will be some spoilers for it upcoming. But it's a kind of short adventure game, very narrative focused, where you're like in this underwater facility after some sort of sleep study was done on your character. You wake up in an underwater facility like many years later, and you're trying to figure out what the heck happened. And in a lot of the game, you see people on hard drives, quite literally. Like you'll interface with a computer and you'll see like Rebecca C, like Tara B, and you could potentially like click on them and hear their last thoughts, or potentially like interact with them. You can actually, like you mentioned, I think with the VR, like creating the environment around you or something, but in some portions of that game, you are waking these consciousnesses back up, and you are pressing levers or different buttons on the computer to set up environments for them. Like, oh, is this going to be a therapist's office? Is this going to be an island? Like, what is going to make them feel calm upon waking up because they have uploaded their consciousness to this computer? And what's kind of twisted about it is that they are basically stuck in this purgatory time loop. Like, they don't have memory of getting woken up and interacted with as you're doing that. You can always choose to like hard reset them. Like, you see there is actual humanity there, but you're able to control it, you know, like to some extent you're able to reset it as if you were playing a game. So like you'll be interviewing a character. This character's like, oh, I thought I, you know, just got done taking a shower. Why am I waking up here? And you got to like try to talk to them calmly. Otherwise they're like, oh shit, I've been uploaded. I'm trapped in the computer. What are you doing to me? And like from there, you know, again, like in an old Atari or Nintendo game, you just like hit the reset switch and they're just like, oh, I thought I woke up like after my shower. And like, that's haunting, that sort of thought, that image, and the fact that you can interact with it. Cause like you sort of put yourself in that person's shoes, right? Like, what if I was about to go into the teleporter and they put my consciousness into the computer, and now every time I wake up, I'm waking up in this like blank void, like surrounded by like nothing, and like, you know, the person or the entity that is actually continuing on is like whoever remained in that chair, like more or less, in that game, when you sat down in the chair, this is the one of the bigger spoilers. When you sat down in the chair for the sleep study, they copied your consciousness to a computer, right? So you have the main character who now went to do a sleep study, and then he like got scanned and then he left totally fine. You don't play as that guy. You play as the consciousness that got stuck in the hard drive banks and then uploaded to a different body. And then from there, 1 or 2 more times, 3 more times, you end up like transferring your own consciousness to a different body. And it ultimately leads to, okay, this is the big spoiler. If you don't want the big spoiler, probably skip forward like 5 minutes. It leads to the big culminating moment of, oh, we're going to do it. We're going to get me onto this spaceship and send me to the moon with my AI companion, and we're going to be happy. This is going to be great. And you're sitting in the chair and you do the upload, and then you watch the ship fly away into space, and you're stuck underwater watching the ship fly away with a copy of your consciousness and a copy of your companion's consciousness. And your companion is kind of like scolding you like through this end bit, because she knew the entire time, like the scanning, like the consciousness is like the scientists who like put all this tech together, but she understands like we're uploading copies. This is for the greater good. Like she understands, and that's her drive. Like it's for the greater good. We got to get humanity to the moon, and this is how we're going to do that. And the main character that we're playing as just wants to escape the lab. Like they just want to get the hell out of this horrible situation. And instead they have to sit and watch technically themselves win. Like after the lights go out and, you know, the character comes to terms with the fact that they're going to be stuck there forever, just sitting down in the black void, we then wake up as the copy that is going into space, and we get the happy ending that he was searching for. And we see that, okay, main character has gotten the happy ending, but like the character I played as basically they're equal parts now. Yeah, the character I played as is stuck at the bottom of the pit, but they are also technically here in heaven, in Valhalla.
Right, yeah, so that, you know, you're throwing the kind of cloning up like into the mix now. Cloning, I guess, is normally thought of as like a corporeal body that's being replicated, but in this case it's like just the consciousness clones.
Yeah, this is trying to speak more towards the, I guess, like mind, spirit, soul type thing,
yeah,
the ethereal.
Yeah. And it is really unsatisfying that, you know, despite, you know, all the, you know, traversing through this whole underwater, you know, landscape and whatnot, at the end of the day, you're still kind of stuck in a world of suffering, you know. At least one of yours, you know, the self, you can only have one person's experience at a time. So even if, you know, if the person in the lab was able to upload a version of their consciousness onto the rocket ship or whatever, that person who's on the rocket ship will then go off and be a completely different person. So there's only going to be diverging, you know, on the path from here. So their minds could have been exactly the same, but they're going to have different experiences from now on. And, you know, different aspects of their lives or of their dispositions will become amplified, right? So,
right,
you know, if I'm like generally a solitary person, let's say, and then you put me on the moon and I'm the only person, then maybe I'll become really creative, you know. But if I am surrounded by other people in the underwater lab, maybe I won't have as much room to be creative, and instead I'll, you know, excel at being social, or you know, maybe humor will be something that really stands out because I have the opportunity to test jokes on people all the time. So, you know, especially like the longer these people are existing in their separate worlds, the more different they'll become. It kind of reminds me of like those pictures of like identical twins, and it's like, this identical twin smoked for 40 years and this one was straight edge, and it's like, look how bad this one looks. You know, it's like those kinds of things where it's like your like choices that you're making like along your path are creating these fairly vast differences if you look at the end result.
I think like part of that ties to like Soma in that you end up doing this like transfer of consciousness like multiple times in the game, and there, as you like look back on your experience, you definitely start to think like, oh well, if those characters could have kept moving, you know, either like, you know, what would happen basically? It's not like who would they have become, because, you know, they're in a very like screwed situation, but it is very much like they've been decommissioned. Like what gives the more current copy like more right to autonomy and stuff than like the copies left behind.
I think it's one of the things that Rick and Morty does well, where they have like different timelines and like, you know, there's a type of Morty in all these timelines, and it's like the game Pocket Mortys was very like a very fun fad in my life, where it was like I want to play Pokemon, but let's see what kind of like Mortys they created and put into this game. So for anybody who hasn't heard of this, it's just like one of the old school Pokemon games where you're like walking around in tall grass, and then there are kind of these random encounters. But all instead of having Pokemon, they're all different Morty. So it could be like leather jacket Morty, or it could be like drooling Morty, you know. And basically the idea being that there are characteristics that are standing out in every, you know, dimension, or, you know, Morty is defined by a certain characteristic or set of characteristics in all of these universes. You know, playing with multiverse theory, obviously, but you know, I remember in the show, there's this moment where like Morty's like, my dead body is buried in the yard there, you know, and he's like a Morty from a different timeline or something, and you know, having to come to terms with the fact that there is this version of himself who, even though he doesn't share a consciousness with that person, he has a lot of similarities with that person, and it's easier to empathize with an alternate version of yourself than it is with somebody else, right? When I see you moving about the world, I'm like, oh, you know, like Carl's just swinging his arms. But if I were to see me, I would be like, oh, that's exactly how I move. Like, you know, it's uncanny that I move like me. You know, like, it's like, how is there another one of me?
Jumping away from Soma, and we can circle back to the clone stuff in a bit, but I wanted to highlight Psychonauts, specifically the Psy King level in Psychonauts 2.
Specifically the fact that you jump into doorways that are on people's brains. How about that?
Yeah, it's got, so like, speaking of like wacky concepts, right? Doors on brains to let you go into psyches, and Psy King takes that to the next level, where you take this like long dormant brain, just a brain alone, and you transfer it into somebody else's mind, I suppose. And basically this brain, when I say dormant brain, it's like, you know, comatose or like near dead brain, like little to no activity. So what they do in the level of the Psy King is kind of illustrate this idea of bringing a dead brain back to life, and it's slowly regaining its senses. And this is just this is talking about just general consciousness, not like questions of like who's the real consciousness, but as this brain went from like just a tiny white light full of dark void around it, it like slowly regained its ability to like hear, smell, like, you know, speak and stuff like that. And anytime it would get one of these senses, it would be so overwhelming, because it would never be just like, oh, I can like smell again. It's like, oh, I can smell. Oh, there's flowers and ramen, and like I can somehow smell music as well. What is happening? And like it would just like cause this actual panic attack to happen, which became a combat encounter. And so the panic, like these panic monsters of like black goo and bone would appear. But I thought it was like a really cool way of illustrating this idea of like bringing someone back from the dead, essentially, but also like, what does that mean cognitively? Like when you're, you know, 6 feet under, and it's been however many months, like I imagine, you know, it's like that Get Out shit, but worse. Like you're not just falling endlessly through this black void. It's just like there's nothing there. There's not even a sensation of falling. So now you're taking that consciousness and reintroducing it to like the taste of water, or the taste of air in general, like the sensation of breathing and like all this other shit, and it just being so overwhelming, and having to like slowly coax it, while also at the same time the level you're playing is like highly stimulating. Like there's psychedelic colors. It's like Woodstock meets like the Pink Floyd album cover through the prism and shit. So it's funny how these two ideas like juxtaposed was like trying to calmly bring this consciousness back to fully like realizing itself, but also, big fucking psychedelic festival where everything is like wacky colors and moving.
Yeah, it reminds me of a couple things. The first is like there was like a mine that collapsed in Chile, like when we were in high school, I think. And I remember when the miners got out, they had to have sunglasses, I think, before they left, and they had to wear them for like weeks. And because they were so used to just like utter darkness, that it would have, kind of sensory overload. I don't know if that's more of like with the eye or more with the brain. I'm not sure like exactly like where the damage would be caused. But yeah, so the idea of like having to slowly redevelop a sense that you've previously had no problem with, or is kind of that, like, your brain still has the potentiality to understand light, but it's been without it for so long. The second thing is like just infants, like babies, for like the first 2 years, right? That's the Piagetian stage is psychomotor, right? So it's like their only way of understanding the world for like 2 years, theoretically, is chewing shit, putting shit in their mouth, walking, touching stuff, like, so it's like they're purely just sensational beings, and that, they have nothing but their senses. There's like really kind of no mental process going on other than, almost like, how we think of animals often is like, they're not sitting there like pondering literature, right? They're like,
yeah,
they are just kind of experiencing their senses. Which, oh man, there's something about that that's like aspirational almost. It's like, if only I could be that zen.
Man, now you're finally identifying with Return to Monkey when you didn't understand it. So we were talking about consciousness, and I don't want to jump games too soon, but we both enjoy Super Hot, and I think that has a fair amount to do with consciousness, at least in the short or light narrative bits that they display. Like Super Hot, again, if you're unfamiliar with this game, first person shooter, time only moves when you move. That's like the big mechanic of the world in the game. And it's really cool. There's a VR version, but also in terms of like narrative and stuff, you're playing a character who's more or less been taken over by some sort of mind control plan done by, I guess, a shadow organization. They never really say like a lot of details, but it is very clear that like you're getting these subliminal messages that tell you to do certain tasks, and ultimately in a couple of scenarios, whatever operative you're playing as has to dispose of themselves as they are commanded to. So I guess that kind of like goes more to the mind control thing than to the splitting consciousness and stuff. But I guess like in terms of consciousness, I guess the question there would be like mind control. Is it something where is this mind control working like the movie Get Out, where I am kind of like conscious of me, I'm still a person, but I am now not in control of what I'm doing, and I can see what is going on around me and that I am not in control? Is it like that? Or is it more like Amityville Horror, where like this subtle malevolent force, is like influencing me, but I'm still within my own wits. Like I'm doing everything of my own accord, but I'm just being influenced.
Yeah, there are like, I'm thinking of it as like kind of 3 levels. One is like the influence that you're talking about. The second is like almost like you're a puppet. You're a conscious puppet. So you have no control over your like physical movements or your body at all, but you have all the thoughts that you would normally have. And then the third would be you have no, like the lights are off. You have no conscious activity and also no control over your body, right? Which in a sense is kind of the least horrifying, because at that point you're a non-entity almost, or you're not you anymore. So there's almost like no responsibility. Like it would be the same as, being dead or something, even maybe not, because other people, I guess the only way that scenario is scary is if someone is using your body and, to convince other people that you're still you. And, so that you're kind of a tool, and that could hurt the people that you love because they may trust you. I'm getting really deep into that hole, but those are kind of the 3 tiers that I see.
Right. I think that's a really good way to put it. So like those tiers again, you were saying were like influence, puppet, and then just non-existent more or less, or tool. So like yeah, puppet because you can still see yourself, but tool is like you can't even like think at that point. I think that's like a really good way to put it, and so like super hot, we'd probably be in the more like influence side of things. Whereas maybe like polymorph in Blizzard or in a like what is it, Blizzard's like World of Warcraft, like you turn someone into a chicken or a sheep, like maybe that's more of the puppet side. But the thing is like if I recall correctly, like when you polymorph somebody, you like don't tell them what direction to run and stuff. So maybe that's kind of like the little wiggle outlier thing, but definitely the middle ground, the puppet, actually would be the greenhouse in Prey. In Prey, you're on this space station and it's like taken over by a bunch of aliens and all this shit. And turns out aliens have mind control powers. And there's this one greenhouse that has like 4 people in it. And it's a very striking scene because when you approach this and you listen in, you hear these people calling for your help, but you see these obvious like purple clouds of evil around their heads. And that's because they're being controlled by this like alien entity floating in the greenhouse. And so part of the challenge now in the game is like for bonus points, don't kill any of these people, that you want to save them to get items or complete a side quest. And in terms of mind control, that's exactly our puppeteer thing. And that's a more, I guess, you were saying like it would be frightening. Like that is the more frightening example of like, here's this thing, I don't know if it's going to kill me, and I know it's taking over my body, and it's making me attack this guy that's trying to help me. Like,
Throughout this episode, we've been talking about, a few different topics, right, that are loosely related. There's the idea of personal identity, what makes a person, the same person. And there's, nested within that conversation is like transporting consciousness or brain control, mind control, those kinds of things. But what about our consciousness as players, right? Like, how do games affect our consciousness, right? When I'm playing as Mario, for example, to what extent is Mario's consciousness, transported into me, so do you have any initial thoughts about that? I could ask more specific prompts about the Mario
I think
thing.
that's a really cool question. And initially I was kind of thinking like, oh, like, yeah, getting into the flow state or like getting immersed, like our own consciousness, like, yeah, those are the two things I would bring up initially. Like getting into the flow state, that's us sort of getting like hyper focused on like the task we're performing, maybe so much so that we lose track of time and our sense of time starts to like, be different, right? That's where we end up thinking we're playing for 30 minutes. Turns out it's 90. Immersion or like getting really like bonded with the character, we have seen points in time where like, gamers get really attached to like a character and then said character is killed or, something like that. Usually it's a character gets killed in a video game and these people are like crying or like they're horribly upset that they've lost this character they've grown a bond with. That's what I first think of, but I don't know how close to like consciousness, like how we've been talking about consciousness. I don't know how much that lines up with it.
Right.
But when I think about,
go ahead.
Yeah,
I was going to say, it reminds me of the guy who like killed himself when his character in D&D died. And like, I don't know if that was like the 80s or something, but it was like, it like created this like panic of like D&D is evil, and like people were like really afraid of it because of the attachment that people were forming. See, I don't think most people. It's interesting with role-playing games specifically, but most people don't identify as the character, even if they have a strong attachment to it. Role-playing kind of causes you to kind of shift the natural ways that you're thinking. Like, I can imagine that someone who's on a role-playing server of some game actually, is thinking differently, maybe thinking in different language than they ordinarily would be, because it's like almost like getting streamlined to be this character for them. So there might be a compromising of one's identity there. I still feel like people generally have agency and can snap out of it, though. I mean, unless they have like kind of severe mental illness, or if they have a break from reality, then perhaps that, a person in that situation may be more susceptible to believing that they're actually this character.
Yeah, and I think, we have seen a lot of role-play games come out. I mean, there's also a big Grand Theft Auto Online role-play community that is viewable on Twitch and so on. And these people, I mean, it's not exactly D&D, but you're making your own character with your own backstory. They have to be in character the entire time, think, talk, act like the character, that type of thing. And these are like wild characters, that you most likely wouldn't be playing in real life, right? And I could absolutely see like growing an attachment to that, as that is something you are like crafting and growing. Like, it's almost like, like we talked about with like Tamagotchis and stuff like that. Like, you're spending a lot of time like nourishing this idea of the character, and like that, I guess in part, like you're fleshing out that consciousness. Like like as that character, you don't know, like you haven't as that character reacted to, say, maybe the movie Scarface or the song Astronaut in the Ocean. Like, and now seeing how that, for the audience especially, like seeing how that character, how that personality reacts to like that stimulus is what gets the views.
I feel like you're equivocating between attachment and like identity, and I don't agree that, like, I could play a game all day and I will never confuse myself for that character. If I play as a spellcaster, I'm not going to believe that I actually have the ability to cast spells or anything like that.
Yeah, I get that, and I want to make myself clear and say, like, I'm not trying to say that like these streamers are like becoming their alter egos or anything like that. I guess like I was just trying to maybe more so illustrate my point about like consciousness as it relates to immersion. But yeah, I guess that's about it.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's kind of interesting is like on these role-playing servers, right? Like the ones that are very strict, right? Like, let's say I get a phone call and I have to take it and I have to like go AFK for a second. Like, I'm not on these role-playing servers, right? But I imagine that like someone is gonna, for the strict servers, someone's gonna have to make an in-game excuse, like, that's justifying their absence, and that depth of trying to inhabit, the consciousness of this character, there is that, it's like the character becomes a part of you almost, right? Like, it's a consciousness within your consciousness, and you're the person who's controlling that inner consciousness. So it's almost like mind control, but for an entity that didn't exist prior to you, you deciding that it did, prior to you creating the character in the screen.
Right. I think in general, like, I think consciousness is, let's say massaged, like from the outside, like something like that. Like, it's slowly like poked and prodded. But I don't think consciousness is ever like super like actually penetrated by like a game or something like that. Like, I don't know what it is, but I think like, yeah, for the most part, you're always recognizing, you're getting an attachment rather than like becoming their consciousness, is what I'm saying. Like, you're never having Mario's consciousness like transported into yours. Even in the metaphorical sense, like, I don't think you're ever reaching a point, like you said, where you're like, Mamma Mia, must save the princess. You're like, oh yes, I need to jump on a thing to save the princess. Like, but
to your point about immersion, right? Like, there's something about Mario where everything feels contrived. The enemies aren't real. It's not based on some like mythos that we can all tap into, but something like God of War, there's a lot of dialogue, there's rage and indignation and all of these, it's borrowing from old legends and myths and whatnot, and perhaps someone playing God of War could be emotionally affected by that, right? Like, maybe they become an angrier person, or they feel like rage is more justifiable given certain circumstances or something like that. I don't think people are walking away from Mario a changed person. I don't think anybody, like, maybe like they're like, wow, games are fun, like that's the way that it would change a person. But and maybe they wouldn't with God of War either. I don't know how susceptible people's like emotions emotional dispositions are to just like kind of hobbies. But with something that is so narrative and emotional, I wonder. I mean, it could be the case that, to your point about like the massaging of consciousness, you're not necessarily going to think you're Kratos, but perhaps Kratos' behavior becomes normalized to you in such a way that you're led down a path of being just maybe even like a tiny bit like angrier or more entitled or something,
Right, yeah. And we're referencing like old Kratos in this, whereas like new Kratos is much more like, I guess, like somber and or he recognizes the like dumb and bad shit he did in like the titles that came before the PS4 one, and talking about like how a character can like influence a person. Like Kratos has multiple moments where he's like, don't be sorry, be better. Like, it's not about how you fall, it's about how you pick yourself back up. And like, in part, I think that, that's for sure like a very human message, a message that can easily connect and resonate with a lot of people, but it also works well because it shows like growth within the character that like maybe some people may want to see on themselves. It's like, oh, this guy went from like ending the entire fucking world because he was super pissed about this one thing. Granted, big thing. But now he realizes that was kind of a dick move and that he was really blinded by revenge. Cough, cough, go listen to our revenge episode. But like now being like sorrowful of that, part of the narrative and the story is like, trying to just carry yourself better to make up for the mistakes of the past.
Right. And I was mentioning the like, old God of War anger, right? But all of that is like completely replaceable with whatever game and whatever emotions they're going for. And on some level, if we take an empiricist approach, you're the sum of all your experiences, right? So any activity you engaged in that didn't change you in some way is like one, impossible, right? Because you're
what was the approach again? What was that called?
Empiricist. Yeah. It's like the idea that your primary way of identity forming and knowledge and like belief forming and all of these things are external. It's a subset of epistemology. So the way that I learn about the world is based on my sensory experiences, right? So I mean, theoretically, right, if we follow that line of thought to the extreme, there's nothing that isn't impacted by any experience that we have, right? So we can be more intentional about this, but when we're playing games, it is very probable that we're going to be changed by that game, or that, and even if it's very slight, So I play Tetris, and maybe I'm better at organizing my closet, or like I have more problem solving skills, or I play a visual novel, and now I have different abilities to empathize with people, and I have like gained the ability to empathize with people. Or, I mean, it could also happen negatively, where I play like a military game and I am desensitized to the horrors of war or something like that, right? So I'm not saying that everything that we do is good, and I'm certainly not condemning that everything we do in gaming is bad. But the idea that we are the same and we are these constant beings who go about having experiences, that's not a way that I don't subscribe to that way of thinking. I think we're very dynamic beings that are greatly influenced by the sum of like these experiences that we have on a daily basis.
Okay. Yeah. I definitely I think I fall under that line of thinking too. What about some consciousness altering games?
So not like so we're done talking about swapping consciousness. We're done talking about empathizing with characters and like changing just like as a byproduct of the game, but now you want to get into like games that are specifically
I'm talking about games that look like I want to keep
directly trying to mess with your senses rather than just kind of indirectly messing with your
while
like,
we're on
identity.
the line of like player consciousness being affected by games, right? I want to talk about some games that got me feeling weird, not because I was connected to like the characters or anything, but it just made me feel like not like uneasy, but like definitely like not normal. And so we'll start with like Superliminal. We've both played this fairly recently, and this is a puzzle game that has a lot to do with scale and perspective. And Superliminal is referring to liminal spaces, which are spaces that are just on the cusp of believable. Like it's almost like surreal surroundings. So let's say if you're in a school, Monday through Friday, super full of kids, teachers, yada yada, you show up there nighttime on a Saturday, walk through the halls as like one of the janitors, and suddenly it's like this eerie place that you're like, I recognize the purpose, and I recognize how this should be. Like there should be kid sounds in these halls and yada yada, but now there's not. And like, so it's like it's a space that feels real, but like it's in an uncanny valley in some way or another. And so in Superliminal, you find a lot of corners you turn, or like that your surroundings are really just like these like Truman Show stage props, and you're basically in a like escape the lab type portal game almost in a sense, but everything is built in a way to make you think you're in like a real location, but it's very clearly not a real location, and there's never a bathroom to pee in or something like that. Like
yeah, one thing I just want to add is that like the core mechanic of the game is like so I would say vision is the sense that is most directly it's commenting on vision, perhaps, or you could certainly do, a reading, where you have this like in-depth analysis of like what it is to see. But for example, right, like let's say there's a book on a dresser. If I'm very close to that book in real life, that book will take up most of my field of view. It'll look very large, despite the fact that it may only be like 6 inches tall. But if if I'm at the opposite end of the room and the book is on the same spot on the shelf, it may only, it'll look significantly smaller, right? It may look smaller than, we would say it actually is, right? I mean, all vision is kind of indexical. There's always a point of view from which you're experiencing vision. And that's really what this game is getting at, where the point of the game, right? If you pick up the book when it's directly in front of you, the actual size of the book remains that size, right? And if I put it down and then I go step very far away and I pick it up, the book, it becomes very small, right? So the actual objects in the world are influenced by how they appear from the first person perspective. And then there's a bunch of puzzle solving that you get into doing this, right?
Right. And now the part of this that kind of like was altering consciousness for me, and it's not like when I say altering consciousness, it's definitely not like, whoa, I'm like starting the trip, man.
You're not tripping, but it is trippy. The whole experience of this.
Yeah, it definitely is trippy. And so for me, a lot of that was kind of like the Truman Show shit that was going on. I definitely really liked the optical stuff that was happening. Like like you said, it's all about field of view or what your vision is, and there's a couple, I'll say, puzzles that have you like stand in a very particular spot and look in a very specific direction to see like a painting on the wall at the right angle. And now that it's at the right angle, you can grab it off the wall and it becomes an actual object in your hand. And that's very cool. But the thing that would like mess with my mind is these moments where I would basically leave the intended area. Like, it's not like I broke the map or anything like that, but it's like I made it over the Truman Show wall. And first off, like, you're kind of semi-regularly going through the same exact locations. Like, many of these puzzle rooms look the same. It's always going to have this red carpet and like these kind of like yellowish walls, and then when you're done with that room, you're going to go to this like series of maintenance hallways with like green walls or whatever. And you see that so often, it kind of has that like effect like from PT, where you're going through that like L-shaped hallway over and over, and it just feels unsettling because you're like structurally. Oh.
Is that
wow.
That a game?
Yeah, so quick aside, PT is short for playable teaser, which PT was a playable teaser for the game Silent Hills, which was going to be a game by Hideo Kojima and Guillermo del Toro with Konami. Long story short, like a lot of things happened, and that's like that game's not happening. But PT is still like very famous to this day and it's also not on the marketplace anymore. So it's actually exclusive. So part of it is like, yeah. So in that game, you're walking down this very hyper detailed, like to real life looking hallway in a like residential house, and much like Superliminal, like you just keep going through these areas that look the exact same. In PT, it's actually like the same hallway, but you know, they're adding in different things and different events. In Superliminal, you're just navigating this like forever complex, and you know that it's happening in the mind because like they give you these little radio announcements throughout the game of Superliminal, like, hey, you're in a dream study and you're in a dream state. So it's kind of like Inception. But I think that's part of where also the conscious altering comes in, and or the sense of unease. I know I'm in a dream, so when like a dream is neutral, I know a dream can be a nightmare. And there's always so one, I know the dream is trying, in air quotes, to create like a neutral to good environment for me, but it's also lit like a play. Like when I look up to the sky, all I see is like darkness and stage lights. And in some cases, because I am like the level design player that I am, I'm like platforming and finding my ways to get out of like nooks and shit that I can. And when you do get out, whatever elevator music that plays in the game just suddenly goes dead. And like sometimes it's just like pure deafening silence. Other times it's maybe just like silence with a bit of a wind blowing sound effect, depending on like where you're at. And like even that transition gives you that sense of unease that the game generally gives you, because it's like, oh, this music doesn't just apply everywhere. Like I feel like I'm in a zone where I shouldn't be, which like puts you on edge even more.
Yeah, dude, I could talk about Superliminal all day. It's fascinating. I love that they talk about dream stuff. I love that they play with like, you know, psychological looming and just the changes of size, you know.
Were there any moments that kind of like put your head on its side or anything like that? Not like physically, but I mean like where you just went like, whoa, shit, like this is making me feel a type of way. That's like,
yes, there was a time where you had to like line up a table. You had to like go. It was in the level where you I'm not going to be able to explain it well. You know, one of the things about this game, it's actually like really good to illustrate this, like my stumbling to try to like explain this one moment, because it is so every moment of that game is difficult to explain, because it's supposed to like just directly affect the way that you see things. You know, I don't have a fully fleshed out vocabulary for what it's like to see in the way that they wanted me to, because they're kind of ineffable experiences. You know, they're not anything that you would actually have in real life. So I'm not used to speaking about these kinds of categories of events, you know? And I don't want to. Like the point is that this game alters your consciousness, and it's wacky. And in the same way that a good optical illusion is something that you can't describe, the entire game of Superliminal is indescribable, you know, and it needs to be played. I really think you only need to play it for like 10 minutes to get a good feel. I mean, it will continue to they continue to iterate on some of the basic things that they introduced very early on. But overall, the game itself isn't super long. So it's kind of like once you start playing, I found it kind of hard to stop. It was like, let's keep this going.
Just when you think you're kind of getting tired and want to put it down, like something new comes out and you're like, whoa, okay, let's play around with this idea. Like how, anyway, let's take a step away from Superliminal. And I'm gonna just bring up Antechamber. There's like a couple other games I wanted to mention, but I don't know if I can do them justice, and I feel like we're kind of running time as it is. So like I'll just talk about Antechamber real quick, and that is this first-person puzzle game that's all about non-Euclidean spaces. So I talked about liminal spaces being these like surreal, like just on the precipice of like a real space, but you can tell something's off with it. A non-Euclidean space is a space that just doesn't make like spatial sense to us. So let's just say you have a door just like in the middle of a big grassy field. There's just this one door, right? And we've kind of seen this in the past. You open up the door and in it is like in the door you can see a igloo in Alaska, and if you walk through the door, you have stepped foot into Alaska, and somehow if you walk back through this door, you're back in that grassy field in Montana. And so that's an example of non-Euclidean space. It's like, oh, this does not make sense. Like, these are not connected, but somehow they are. And similar things can be done for like the hallways and stuff. I think that actually happened with Superliminal at some point. There was one of those like pick left or right, like keep going down and pick the right sequence of left or right, or the hallway ends up like impossibly circling back to the beginning. In Antechamber, they do this a lot, and it just I don't recall the exact like way to describe it, but it just sends your sort of like spatial recognition and or reasoning into like an interesting an interesting state. Like, again, I can't really describe it, but when you're like, it's almost like, I guess, if you're trying to map out a mansion whose hallways are always shifting and stuff, you know, almost kind of like the Harry Potter staircases, how they move around and things, but like, what if their hallways and their classrooms moved around as well, like
so
every 24 hours?
Gosh.
So disorienting. But there is a method to the madness, at least in Antechamber, right? There is still a structure, and there's almost like a Metroidvania aspect to it. So now not only is your mind thinking of like, okay, this hallway is present only if I walk down this hallway and flip this switch first. Otherwise, that's going to send me to this other section. And now I got to double back through all of these weird, wacky doorways and hallways to get to this point.
So for the skill tree, I want to circle back to the beginning of the conversation, which was more about personal identity than consciousness, and perhaps the skill tree will help to make the connection between them even stronger, right? So one of the like first ways that I encountered the concept of like personal identity, right, is the Ship of Theseus, which I think is like become a pretty popular and like it's a pop culturally.
Yeah, the second it made it into a Marvel film, like it's in the pop culture.
Right. So basically the Ship of Theseus, it works like this. Theseus has a ship. He, is sailing around the world, and one of the boards of that ship becomes rotten, and he then replaces that board, right? Right. So a second piece becomes rotten. He has to replace that, right? And then eventually the entire ship has been recreated by these new boards, right? And it's raising the question: is this the same ship that it was prior to any of the boards were rotting? There's like a corollary to this that's like, what if we took all of the rotten boards and recreated the ship from the rotten boards, right? So we have this new ship that's like fully functional and with all the newer boards, but that have been sailing around with Theseus the whole time. And then we have all the boards that were discarded one by one. And, which of those, and people can speak to their different intuitions about which of those is more the ship, right? But if you're the kind of person who believes that the ship that has been had the boards replaced slowly over time continues to be the same ship, right? That's really an argument for personal identity being a product of like physical, the physical changes, right? So at the corollary or the Ship of Theseus can kind of be seen as a metaphor for human beings, where we constantly have cells that are dying and regenerating all the time. And me right in this moment versus me 5 minutes ago may have, different cells. Their new ones may have arisen and some of them may have died. And
that kind of connects a bit to the Mike TV thing, right? If you're talking about the cells, like the cells being who you are and them dying, like Mike TV getting his cells like ripped apart and or rebuilt or built as new cells.
It's a really good, I'm glad you bring that up. So the reason why it's kind of different than the Mike TV example is because if the Mike TV example would be every single board of the Ship of Theseus being torn apart and then new boards being replaced exactly in the same space where the old ship was. What makes the Ship of Theseus, interesting to us is that, or we do I think a lot of people intuitively would say, if I get my alternator replaced in my car, it's still my car. It's still the same car that I was driving the day before I got it replaced, right? So the fact that it's happening slowly over time leads us to believe, many of us, that there is continuity there, right? That physical continuity is what is significant in the identity of the thing, right?
Yes.
And we could say that about human beings too, and then perhaps a personal identity is as simple as physical continuity. In which case, we could say that like the Mike TV or like the Star Trek teletransporter, Derek Parford's example, it's a very clear case of, well, that thing is not physically continuous, right? It's in a different place in space time. There was a period where it didn't exist at all physically, right? But then what do we do in situations like Freaky Friday, right? Or in the case where someone gets amnesia, right? If someone gets amnesia, so if you believe in the physical continuity, you would say, well, same identity, same personal identity, right? And that raises like difficult ethical questions with like legal stuff, right? If I kill you, right, and then I fall while I'm fleeing the scene, and I wake up with amnesia, I'm still the same. I'm in the same body. I still have, I have continued to occupy the same space, but should I be liable? I am actually innocent, because I'm a new person in a sense, right? So that's where like John Locke comes in. We've mentioned him once on the podcast before, but early modern philosopher. So his idea of consciousness, I'm going to link an article about this too. He has memory is essentially the primary component of his beliefs on consciousness. So in the case where someone has amnesia, Locke would argue that that person is a different person. There's no sense in saying that they're the same people at all, because
they don't have the memory of the past experiences that would have shaped that consciousness.
Yeah.
Right?
So the identity that we have is basically the awareness of all of the awarenesses of moments that we've had in the past, right? So they're just kind of like bundled together in this thing that I call me. It's these individual moments that I continue to recollect, right? There are problems with this. It breaks down because of the fallibility of memory, and notably, like Thomas Reid is a guy who kind of like takes this down, and he has this really interesting thought experiment that's like, if you stole something when you were 10 years old, and then you stole something at 40 years old, and then you stole something at 80 years old, do you have to remember each of those moments, right? If the 40-year-old you stole something when you were 10 years old and you remember that, and the 80-year-old you remembers stealing something at 40 years old but doesn't remember stealing something at 10 years old, it kind of breaks down with the transitive property, right? So he would say that the 40-year-old is the same as the 10-year-old, but the 80-year-old isn't the same as the 10-year-old, but the 80-year-old is the same as the 40-year-old, right? So but like, how could that be possible? How can the 80-year-old be the 40-year-old and the 40-year-old be the 10-year-old, but the 80-year-old not be the 10-year-old? So that's a fallibility of memory that, that Reid brings up. All that to say, these are two completely different frames, the Lockean approach and the Ship of Theseus. One is completely mental, and the other one is like completely physical, right? And they're both different ways of approaching the concept of personal identity. And I know I keep like bringing up these like kind of odd legal examples, or like, thought experiment, like legal thought experiments. Like, what do we do in this case? Like Freaky Friday situation. Like, do we lock up Jamie Lee Curtis or Lindsay Lohan? I don't know. But I think that like legal issues is like one of the areas where personal identity becomes most interesting, right? It becomes like the questions are really hard hitting, and you're kind of putting your money where your mouth is if you're willing to, remove someone from society, or, like if someone is like deserving of a punishment or praise. Even we could look at it the opposite way. Like, what if there was someone who's about to receive the Nobel Prize and they got amnesia? Are we still going to give them the Nobel Prize even though they're an idiot now? Let's say they have no idea about their contributions to chemistry. Like, are they going to get a Nobel Prize? Like, yeah, I don't know. That's all I really got for you there. It's not really related to games at all, but just two different frames, and the idea is to kind of like complicate the narrative about like how we might ordinarily have been thinking about personal identity. Perhaps it's not something that you've ever thought about, but, like, there are a lot of different approaches, and it's not as simple as whatever your intuitions are, probably. People have been writing about this for hundreds of years, and the questions are still unanswered, which is basically how everything in philosophy works, and why there are a lot of people who detest it, because it's like, oh, what's the point of raising these questions that you'll never answer? But to think about them and to challenge yourself and to try to suss out your own intuitions and make those stronger, and have a more rational approach to things that many people take for granted. That's the goal. Do you have thoughts, or do you want to explore any particular angle of this?
My overall thoughts are I enjoy this skill tree. I think it ties well to our talks on Soma, and I think just like a lot Soma is what I'm really kind of focusing in on, especially with the sort of Ship of Theseus side and the personal identity. I feel like those two together just really work for that game. And yeah, Ship of Theseus, like I was mentioning before, featured in that one funny bit at the end of WandaVision where like the two visions are circling each other, and like that again is like, hey, are you me or are you yourself? And I guess maybe that also kind of combines it in a sense, because Vision, proper Vision, and then copy Vision, they're talking and shit, and like he's like, hey, like I remember all of this stuff, but like you never actually did that stuff, so like do you want, like they're eventually circling and getting to the point of like, you have my memories, but like you're a different guy. Like if you want, you could go to Dairy Queen right now and get a burger, and I could go to fucking Wendy's and get like a different thing. And, that resolves however it does. But I thought that was also a pretty good scene to kind of combine these two ideas in a sense. I don't know if you kind of see the same connections in that scene that I'm talking about, but does that seem to relate fairly well outside of the fact that they simply say Ship of Theseus in that scene?
Definitely. I mean, any time you have two people who are interacting like that are the same, that on some level feel the same, whether that's like old Marty McFly, like, young Marty McFly, or, Freaky Friday, or Double Vision, whoa. Yeah, I definitely think that that's where these questions kind of come up. And it's so easy to pull from these fictional narratives because they're exploring the reason why people want to explore these, I think, in like works of fiction is because they do have application outside of fiction, but it's hard to access them and hard to talk about them without having these like really like contrived scenarios or something, like it helps us to push beyond the bounds of reality so that we have a better understanding of actual reality, of our situation.
Thank you for listening to Deep in the D-Pad. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and share us with your friends.
For updates and discussion, follow us on Reddit at r/deepinthedpad, Facebook at deepdpad, and subscribe to Deep in the D-Pad on YouTube. Don't forget to hit the bell.
And if you want to ask us questions or you had a chance to share your own D-Pad delight on the show, email us at askdeepinthedpad@gmail.com. Be sure to put question or delight in the subject line.
Big thanks to 8-Bit Jazz and Kevin MacLeod for supplying the music for the show.